So I'd like to introduce you to Craig. Craig is, I'll get this right, he's with the Glencore Environmental and Community team at Newlands Coal, and he's spent the last 28 years as an environmental specialist with them. He'll talk about the Newlands mine and the work that they're doing as they move into mine closure and they're transitioning that land back to grazing. What's really interesting is Craig actually started off as a jackaroo with Stanbroke, so he absolutely knows what you guys did, and he went into mining as a surveyor's assistant, which he tells me then's a pretty direct pathway into that environmental space. So he's actually an environmental scientist and is here today to talk to you about the trials that they've been doing with Calinta Pastoral Company. And Stacey, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it from Calinta, but Calinta is actually the pastoral arm of Glencore, I found out when I asked a few questions, and they've identified some areas that were struggling in relation to the reclaiming that was being done, and the general manager went to the Newlands guys and asked to run a couple of trials to improve those areas. So that's what Craig is so excited to be talking to you about all by himself. So come on down, Craig.
Thanks for that. Yes, I've got to give apologies for both Ali Spice, my land management coordinator, and Stacey Hawke, our Calinta station manager for Barwon Eastern Creek stations. They're both busy doing various things. Ali's actually looking after our traditional owners right now. We're getting some cultural heritage clearance done, and Stacey's in the middle of a pretty intense mustering round. So it was up to me to come and present. I was actually just going to go, here you go. So before we start, I'll give you some history about what Newlands is, where we are, etc., and what Glencore is as well. So Newlands is one of the 6 open-cut coal mines and underground coal mines in Queensland for Glencore. We're in the northern part of the Bowen Basin, near Glendon. Nearby to us, we've got Collinsville, Newlands, Hale Creek, then further down the road, you've got Clermont, Oakey Creek, Rolleston, etc. Newlands is going into closure. We finished our last coal production in February this year. We've been going for 40 years, so 40 years this year. So it's a pretty big achievement. We've currently got about 3,000 hectares of rehab that we've done over the last 40 years, and we've got about 2,800 hectares left to go. So our closure program is going to occur over the next 10 years or so, and we've got a lot of work to do. We've transitioned our entire production workforce over into our rehabilitation workforce. So we're a bit different to some other mines when they close. They generally shut, have a care and maintenance period, bring in contractors and do all the work. However, Newlands is the first in one of Glencore's sites as well to transition its entire production workforce over to rehab, which is using our own gear, our own people, which is a really good bonus for us, and also helps support the town of Glendon to maintain its viability as well. So Newlands itself is made up of 15 mining leases. We're about 70 k's long by 40 k's wide. We've got 29 open cut pits, and most of our post-mining land use that we're focusing on is for grazing, with about 10% roughly for native vegetation. Probably the key thing that I picked up from Dick's talk was that form versus function. So coming from a highly altered landscape that an open cut mine is, the function of that is to us to return it back to a grazing landscape. Sorry. So with the rehab that we've done over the last 40, 30 years or so, most of it's been pretty successful. There are areas that need improvement, and that's where we were approached by John O'Kane, who's the General Manager of Calinta Pastoral Company. Calinta is a wholly owned entity of Glencore, they're the pastoral arm. And John hadn't long come on board as the GM, quite excitable sort of fella. He approached me in 2020 after going to a reef catchments workshop, I believe, up in Bowen. And so John approached us to be involved in an experimental high-intensity herd grazing trial on some of our less successful rehab. So the concept was based around a similar trial at Glen Alpine Station north of Bowen, which was run by NQ Tropics at the time. In that situation, the property had a really badly eroded gully and paddock. It was in pretty good friable black soil, and it had pretty good grass cover, but unfortunately, the gully that was in that paddock was consistently moving forward and head cutting about a metre a year. So the property owners, who do holistically planned grazing, they decided to try and get a whole bunch of cattle into those areas and do it over a 6-week period in a very small, tight pen and have them camp there overnight for over 6 weeks. So the intent was they treat the gully system by penning the cattle in overnight until the head cut and sides were thoroughly broken down, and a layer of manure and urine slurry, which was about 300 mils thick, was spread across the gully area. They termed it as biological carpeting. The paddock in particular saw a huge response to pasture and stabilisation of the gully after the trial period. And monitoring by NQ Tropics showed there was a pretty big rise in pasture diversity and density. So prior to this trial, there was about 3 species identified in that area. And after it, there were 17 species of grasses and forbs and other things. Based on that trial that John had seen, we set up a similar trial area of what's called our Ramp 12 rehab area. This area in our Eastern Creek area, the rehab there varied from 10 to 7 years old, and we had some basically bare as the board sort of areas, and we had a slope area that had a fair bit of erosion on it. So we started to do that in February 2021 with assistance with Calinda. So this is what Glen Alpine basically looked like prior and after, and we were hoping for a similar response. So that's the location of where we are. The first picture on the left is all of our mining leases, and the red dot up on the top right-hand side is in the Eastern Creek mining domain area. That whole red area is actually just all of Ramp 12, which used to be an open cut pit and had been fully rehabilitated. And there was 2 sections there that we identified we needed to work on. The reason for selecting the trial site was that Calinda are the background landholders for this area. They had about, 300 head of weaners that were turning out of the yards, and the opportunity was there to, 1, train them up, and 2, to do this trial. We had cattle, water and adequate day feed, so we had the night paddocks where they were being penned in, and then we let them out in the general rehab area afterwards. So we had the 2 night paddocks were established on one flat bare area and the other on a slope. We fenced the area with electric fencing. The Calinda guys did that, and Newlands, NOC, provided the labour, grader and dozer to establish the fence lines and access tracks. Took a bit of work, but we got it done pretty quickly. So then the 600 head of young cattle, the weaners, were moved onto the trial area, and they moved in and out every day by Calinda staff. And prior to the trial starting, Calinda had their own pasture agronomist, so she came and did an assessment of the area prior, during and after of vegetation and biomass. They actually use a program called SIBO Labs is the main program they use for doing that. And then at the end of it, they followed up with a post-wet season assessment. We provide the water, the tanks for the cattle. Calinda also supplemented the day feeding with molasses in the night paddocks as well. Calinda sourced and distributed also 80,000 dung beetles from Canberra with CSIRO approval. There were 8 different species of dung beetles that we used. And our general manager at the time and the general manager of Calinda released the dung beetles. We had a pretty good photo opportunity at the time. First time my boss said, having fun playing with shit. So this is the area before the trial. That top photo is the flat area, and the second one is the slope. It's quite bare up on that top middle section. So during the trial, bare as their bones. The bottom flat area, I think because it was flat, you had much more, a thicker crust of manure and urine getting onto that area, but the slope area didn't take as much. We actually supplemented hay and things like that in there as well. And then in March this year, it does take a while for it to come back. But there is still erosion on that slope area. We'll probably have to go back and mechanically treat that, so go in and rip it a bit. But the vegetation response has been amazing. And to the flat area, you can't even tell. It was bare 2 years ago. Limitations for this process that we found was that it's only limited, you're limited by the size and the number of cattle you can do, and it's only really good for smaller areas. You can't do it on a large landscape sort of aspect. Being rehab, mine site rehab, there's a lot of rock. So cattle were getting footsore a fair bit, walking in and out all the time, but they were getting used to it. The benefits of it was the cattle were getting very, very quiet, being moved every day, and they're getting used to being moved every day as well. We are going to do another trial with these guys this year, sitting in the same area. We've got another bare area we're going to do and see how we go with that. But what we've learned is that it's not an instantaneous response. It does take time. However, the vegetation response over time just exponentially increases. And following on from that, we'll also use fire, do some cool burns in our whole rehab area as well to improve our vegetation response. We're also entering into a ACARP program with CQU on grazing cattle on rehabilitated slopes. There's been a fair bit of research done previously in the mining industry on getting cattle under rehab, but we've got an issue like other mines where we've got reasonably steep slopes that we rehabilitate. There's been no research done as to how effectively cattle can graze on those slopes. So we're entering into that program with CQU. And that's about it. Any questions?
Can you pop your hand up if you have a question, please? I have a quick...
Ooh. Hi, Craig. It might have been in the presentation and I missed it, but what was the diversity in the vegetation before and after, and how long was the night paddock system set up for?
So diversity before, if I can go back, no. Diversity in those bare areas is very, very low. You only had a bit of buffel growing here and there, maybe some silo or secca, that sort of thing. The slopes were probably a little bit better than the flat area. There's a fair bit of geochemistry involved with that as well. It's a pretty saline soil. So we actually used gypsum as well after the treatment had been done, and getting the cattle to walk through it again helped get that gypsum into the soil also. We used a standard seed mix for grazing, and we went and reseeded those areas as well. But we didn't do a great deal of seeding. We just let whatever was there come up. And then the diversity afterwards, we probably picked up about 15, 20 different species. So it's pretty impressive. And that's more from letting the cattle out into the wider rehab area, coming back, and they've obviously digested seeds and all the rest and pooed it out.
Another hand up. I'm curious, this project has lasted a couple of years. Once you've got your soils to a level which you feel is sustainable and resilient, will then that area continue to be managed by Glencore, or is it would it be open to being sold? You know, what's the focus for that land in the future?
The whole aim for rehabilitation on any mine site is that you do your rehabilitation. There's a number of years it has to go through to be established. And then the next step in that is getting it certified by the Queensland Government, by DES, that it meets its post-mining land use. There's a whole lot of factors you've got to get certified with that. We're going through certification right now for about 500 hectares. And then the ultimate end game is that that land gets returned back to the landholder. That wasn't me.
Thanks for the presentation, that's great. Just wondering, I know that Glencore have mines elsewhere in the country. Are you doing any of this work on any of the other sites down like Hunter Valley or?
Not at the Hunter. Their conditions are pretty different to ours. Whereas we're Newlands and a few other sites, we're around 90% grazing of post-mining land use. Your mines in the Hunter Valley in particular, they'd be up to about 5% grazing. It's just the conditions, the regulatory conditions they have to meet down there. It's a totally different regulatory type landscape to Queensland. We are using this at Collinsville as well. Collinsville's a pretty difficult site. It's over 100 years old. And Calinda's right next door, same as us at Newlands. And they've had some really good success on some pretty horrible overburden and spoil. Obviously, if you can get topsoil on it, it helps. But when you've got a 100-year-old mine, that topsoil stripping in 100 years ago wasn't exactly a priority.
I'm coming.
When it goes back to the grazier, how do you make sure that he's doing the right thing?
That's quite difficult because once we've done our job and we've achieved certification that it meets its post-mining land use, there's really, unless you have a contractual agreement with the landholder, there's no tool, no regulatory tool for them to maintain stocking rates, to make sure it's not overstocked, you know, that sort of thing. Historically in this Eastern Creek area, it had been massively overgrazed prior to grazing. One of the guys that works for us, one of our local contractors, he used to be a ringer on the station, and he said this is the only instance where he's seen mining improve the country, which is great.
Fantastic. Jason.
Hello. Just given the fact you mentioned that you've got specific geotechnical sort of conditions, a la, I'm guessing, no topsoil, you know, and this is soil dredged up from a long way under the surface, and so it's in a way, I guess, sterile biologically. Do you find that, and has there been any attempt to introduce biology into the soils?
Not in this instance. So you're right in the fact that the whole soil profile has been turned over. It's a totally anthropogenic soil, so it's a man-made soil profile. We're fortunate at Newlands that our soil geochemically isn't very hostile. So we've got a little bit of salinity, bit of dispersiveness, that sort of stuff. And where we do have topsoil available to us, it's pretty good quality, but we only put on about 100 mils thick. For the biological stuff, no, we haven't focused on that. It's more about just getting vegetation establishment as the first step. And then you'll find the biology improves after that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig.